In 1999, UNESCO declared today, March 21st, World Poetry Day to promote the reading, writing, publishing, and teaching of poetry throughout the world. Celebrated poet and scholar Di Brandt is Winnipeg's Poet Laureate, and she's joined me in the Diamond Lane for a conversation and reading. Good afternoon, Di.
Hi, Simon. Lovely to be here.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to have you here on World Poetry Day. I was wondering if we could begin this interview by doing a reading.
I'd love to.
And what are we going to hear?
So I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote quite a while ago from my first book, which the book was called Questions Asked My Mother. And this is a poem about a mother, about my mother.
Perfect.
My mother found herself one late summer afternoon lying in grass under the wild yellow plum tree jeweled with sunlight. She was forgotten there in spring, picking rhubarb for pie, and the children home from school hungry, and her new dress half hemmed for Sunday. The wind and rain made her skin ruddy like a peach. Her hair was covered with wet fallen crabapple blossoms. She didn't know what to do with her, so she put her up in the pantry among glass jars of jellied fruit. She might have stayed there all winter, except we were playing robbers, and the pantry was jail, and every caught thief of us heard her soft moan. She made her escape while we argued over who broke the pickled watermelon jar, scattering cubes of pale pink flesh in vinegar over the basement floor. My mother didn't mind. She handed us mop and broom smiling and went back upstairs. I think she was listening to herself in the wind, singing.
Live in the Diamond Lane, you just heard Di Brandt reading some of her poetry in this 4 o'clock hour. That's absolutely vivid imagery and familiar to me. You know, you mentioned you wrote that a while ago, but those images, I mean, playing cops and robbers and everything else, I mean, it feels so at home to me. It's so relatable.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Well, you're the Poet Laureate of Winnipeg. I want to begin by asking, what does that mean exactly?
Well, it's a public appointment by the city, in this case, to honor poetry as a public discourse and to honor poets as public figures, and to just try to restore a little bit of the public prominence of poetry, which was considered until very recently around the world. A sort of major, important public discourse. So it's lovely that Canada has been really recognizing that and trying to help preserve that.
Mm-hmm. So you're an ambassador for poetry.
Yes.
Being that public persona that it is, in a way, what kind of reception have you gotten from audiences?
Just lovely. Everybody is very delighted that we have a Poet Laureate in Winnipeg now. And it's a way of, sharing poetry with all the people. Is sometimes in Canada and elsewhere, it has become a very professionalized thing, and it's lovely to also be able to celebrate the wide, popular appeal and interest that people have in it.
Where do you typically perform your poetry, and do you have any most memorable moments in these locations? Like anyone who really, after your reading, resonated in a way that you didn't expect?
Well, I can tell you one of the most interesting poetry performance experiences I ever had was I performed at a poetry festival in Medellin, Colombia, South America. And I discovered the people there, most of the people who came to the festival were very poor and they couldn't afford to buy books. But they loved poetry. There were 50 poets there from around the world. It was quite astonishing. And on the opening night and the closing night, we read to 5,000 people.
Wow.
It was really quite extraordinary. And people read in their own languages, and then they were translated. We were all translated into Spanish as well. And it was just such a wonderful experience. And just the way we were welcomed there, that was like really a magical experience and very inspiring.
It must have been. I can only imagine 5,000 people enjoying that together. I mean, poetry has taken you around the world. It really has. But I'm wondering if we can return to your roots. In past interviews, you've kind of spoken to your upbringing in a poetic family in rural Manitoba. What are your earliest memories in poetry?
Yes, I grew up in a very traditional little Mennonite village called Rhineland in southern Manitoba. And my mother's family my grandfather was a minister, and my grandmother was a very artistic person, musically and also with her hands. And Poetry is very important in this family. And so every Christmas and every Easter and every birthday, and my grandma's birthday, we, the children, would all have to recite poems to her. So we would have to memorize these long poems and recite them flawlessly because we were in heavy competition with the cousins, and everybody was watching. So the honor of this family was at stake. So, so
no
it was
pressure.
And it was considered really important from a very young age. And it was also, because it was a religious upbringing, and poetry is often spoken from the pulpit in church, and of course the Bible is itself a book of poetry. So I was very influenced by and by the hymns we would sing. So it was a very poetic upbringing on so many levels.
Yeah, I remember, kind of in a shared upbringing, I remember my grandma reading me poetry and me having to recite poetry of Ukraine's national poet, Taras Shevchenko. But I never thought to myself, I should write my own poetry. When did you start writing your own poems?
Well, now that was different in my village. Everybody wrote poetry. This was basically oral culture,
Yeah.
But everybody made up poems for each other for their birthdays or weddings, funerals. So this was still this old way of thinking that poetry is an important language that everybody has access to, and everybody can compose beautiful poems for each other. So nowadays people do it maybe like on Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
When they fall in love or something. Mm-hmm. But we're now used to sending each other greeting cards. We buy the little poem that we send to people. That's more common now. But it not so long ago, everybody did that. And in my village, everybody did that. So I was making up poems from a very young age, and I started writing. As soon as I knew how to read and write, when I went to school, I was writing poems and got lots of affirmation for it from many people. Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating. Your poetry's been adapted for theater, radio, television, set to music, and performed in dance. Being a classical radio station, I find myself introducing a lot of works that were inspired by or just settings of poetry. What makes poetry so collaborative?
Yes, we love musicians. We poets, we love musicians because they really have a great understanding and appreciation of poetry and the musicality and language. So, yeah.
Is that what really makes it so collaborative for you? When you're writing your poetry and you see it take on these new forms, what changes in the poetry? Does something change?
Writing as such is like I always think that writing is it's a kind of a bipolar profession, because on the one part of it is very lonely and alone, and you're sitting in your room and writing stuff. You're not talking to anybody or going anywhere. You're just by yourself thinking in your own head. But then there's this other part that's very public when you perform it to people with people, and so I think it's the loneliness of the alone part that is a stimulus for wanting to find interesting ways to collaborate with other people. So to just bring a little more sociality into that part of the process. And of course, it's so lovely if you can figure out a way to collaborate with other artists. It took me quite a while. I had a lot of experiments in this area before I sort of figured out how to do it with other people. And musicians especially are very lovely to collaborate with, I must say.
And they too share that little bit of solitary element as well, right? You spend all this time practicing this music, and then the audience sees the final output, really. You forget how much work went into it. And that, to me, speaks to poetry, is that collaborative nature of it, finding that commonality to which you speak. This last question I want to ask you is a little bit broad, so I hope it doesn't sound naive or something like that. But in 2018, what can people learn from poetry? What should they take from poetry?
Well, I think it's sometimes people say that poetry is a specialized language, but in fact, we are living in a world where there's all these different jargons. Every discipline, every profession, every kind of work has its jargon. It's all the other languages that are specialized, actually. And poetry is really the language of the common experience, and it really uses very ordinary words, and it's about our ordinary experiences and also our extraordinary experiences. And it's a magical language that can accommodate, the very simple and the silly, and also the very deep and the very spiritual and visionary aspects of our experience. And so I think it's a really important language. It's a language of the heart, a language of the spirit, and it's a language that we all very much need to be able to have in our lives, so that we can, honor that part of us.
Absolutely. Before I ask you to read one more of your poems, I should mention that here at the station we're celebrating World Poetry Day on Friday in conjunction with the Winnipeg Arts Council event that's taking place at Gas Station Theatre. Di, what can you tell us about that event?
Yes, it has been a great privilege to host my first event as a poet laureate, together with the Winnipeg Arts Council. So we're going to have a poetry reading evening where we are featuring poetry in many languages. We're going to have, I think, 15 languages represented. And so we went around and we found people in Winnipeg from all walks of life who speak another language and have a cultural heritage, and would like to that they would like to celebrate publicly with us. And people chose very meaningful poems from their heritage to share with us. And I'm working hard to practice saying all their names, so that I'm going to be the most nervous person there, trying to pronounce their names right in all these different languages. So I hope you all people listening, I hope you consider coming out for this event. It's a community-friendly event. And hope you all come out to enjoy listening to all these different languages that are spoken in this city all the time. And you will get to hear it in its most beautiful form.
We are such a multicultural city, aren't we?
Yes.
Di Brandt, thank you so much for coming by the Classic 107 studio today. It was a real pleasure to have you. As you grab one more poem, I'll let you know, if you head over to classic107.com, you can read more about that event taking place on Friday. To round out this interview, Di, what are we going to hear?
Well, thank you so very much for having me here on your show, Simon, for promoting our event. So I'm going to read you quite a new poem. It's called Mid-Afternoon Benediction, and it's about the kind of chance encounters that can happen when you walk through a park. Mid-Afternoon Benediction. That time I crossed Michel Jean Park in late August on the sunlit gravel path, and you and your friends rose like a vision through the splendid green-leafed ashes on the hidden mud bank of the mighty red. You were all in tattoos and black leather, your dark eyes wide open and spacey. And I wanted to swerve so as not to have to meet you, but I didn't. I stayed true, and your friends all warmly greeted me too, though it was you alone who turned back to chat with me and shake my hand. You asked me my name, and you told me yours, which I remember now as Dominic, though it may have been Richard or Maurice. And you asked me to pray for you, right there in the sun-streaked grass beside the gravel path. And I stammered out a small prayer, and you pressed my hand warmly to thank me and returned smiling to your friends. And I stumbled home a little ashamed not to have prayed more elegantly for you, and I said the prayer again, Dominic, mentioning your name and your warm, strong hands and gentle heart. I spoke of your hard life and your cut-up hopes and the large grace you carry even so, and I thanked you for the benediction, the blessing you gave me too, there in the grass beside the gravel path of Michel Jean Park, the shine of your bright spirit pouring living water upon the parched fields of my lacerated spiritual inheritance, blast of beauty, whiff of the divine, glimpse of resurrection, in this unlikely baptism, this unexpected ordination among the green leaf trees, rippling like lace in the slightly shivering, singing, shimmering mid-afternoon breeze.
The vivid, familiar imagery of Di Brandt. Di, thank you for being here on this World Poetry Day.
Thank you.